Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, even by those trained to cross them. I'm Officer Rachel Martinez, K-9 handler with the Clallam County Sheriff's Office, and I've been working search and rescue with my German Shepherd, Kodiak, for 8 years. We've found lost hikers, tracked suspects through miles of wilderness, and located evidence that seemed impossible to find. Kodiak has never failed to follow a scent trail, never refused a command, never shown fear of terrain or weather. That's what made what happened in Olympic National Forest so unsettling, and why I still request different assignments when calls come in from that sector. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in October of 2019. A day hiker named Jennifer Walsh had failed to return from a solo trip along the Elwha River Trail. Her car was still in the parking lot. Her emergency contact hadn't heard from her, and the weather was turning. Standard missing person protocol in National Forest territory. I loaded Kodiak into the unit and drove the 40-minute route to the trailhead, expecting another routine search that would end with a tired hiker found safe, maybe embarrassed about getting turned around. The parking area was already busy with activity. Rangers from Olympic National Park, additional deputies from our department, and volunteer search teams were organizing grid patterns and communication checks. I recognized most of the faces we'd worked together on dozens of searches over the years. What I didn't recognize was the tension in their voices, the way conversations seemed to stop when I approached. Ranger Peterson briefed me on the situation. Jennifer Walsh, 28, experienced hiker, had signed the trail register at 6:30 the previous morning for what should have been an 8-hour round-trip hike. Her emergency beacon showed her last known position approximately 6 miles in, near Convict Creek Crossing. The weather had been clear when she started, but fog had rolled in around noon and hadn't lifted since. "Anything unusual about the trail conditions?" I asked, checking Kodiak's gear. Peterson hesitated. "We sent a preliminary team up yesterday evening when she didn't return. They made it to the creek crossing, found some disturbed ground that might be her campsite, but..." He glanced at the other rangers. "They turned back earlier than planned." "Weather? Visibility issues," he said, but his tone suggested there was more to it. I started Kodiak on Jennifer's scent using a sweatshirt from her car. He picked it up immediately, strong, clear, confident. We headed up the trail with 2 deputies, Martinez and Chen, following at a distance for radio relay. The path was well maintained, clearly marked, nothing that should trouble an experienced hiker or challenge a search dog. For the first 3 miles, everything proceeded normally. Kodiak tracked steadily, occasionally circling back to confirm the scent trail, his behavior textbook perfect. The fog was thick but not impenetrable, and we made good time toward the creek crossing. I could hear the other search teams spread across the area, their radio chatter a constant background of coordinates and status updates. Then Kodiak stopped. We were approximately a quarter mile from the creek crossing, standing at the edge of a clearing where the trail split around a grove of old-growth cedars. Kodiak had been tracking confidently, nose to the ground, when he simply sat down and looked at me, not the alert position he takes when he finds what he's searching for, but a flat refusal to continue. "Come on, boy," I said, checking the area ahead for obstacles. The trail looked clear, no deadfall or washouts. "Track on." Kodiak whined and backed up 2 steps. In 8 years of partnership, I had never seen him refuse a direct command. I radioed the situation to Peterson, who suggested we try a different approach route. We circled around the grove, picking up the trail on the far side of the clearing, but the result was identical. The moment we reached what appeared to be the same invisible boundary, Kodiak stopped, sat, and refused to advance. "Martinez here," came a voice over the radio. "We're having the same issue." Then Chen, "My dog won't cross either. Something's got them spooked." I looked up through the fog and realized we could see lights from the other search teams. All of us stopped in a rough line at various points around the same general area. Every dog, German Shepherds, Bloodhounds, Labs, mixed breeds, trained for different specialties, had refused to continue past what appeared to be some kind of perimeter only they could detect. All units, this is Peterson. Fall back to the clearing and regroup. We'll approach this systematically. As we gathered, I noticed the dogs weren't just refusing to advance, they were actively agitated. Kodiak kept looking over his shoulder toward the trail ahead. His ears pricked forward, but his body language, showing stress signals I'd learned to read over years of partnership. The other dogs displayed similar behavior, alert, but unwilling, as if they could sense something we couldn't. Has anyone actually made it to the creek crossing? I asked. Deputy Williams nodded. Yesterday's preliminary team reached it, but they said visibility was almost zero by then. Did they have dogs with them? A pause. Just Ranger Morrison's search dog, Tracker. Peterson's radio crackled. Peterson, this is base. We've got a problem. Morrison called in about an hour ago. Tracker hasn't returned to the station. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in the span of that radio transmission. What do you mean, hasn't returned? Peterson asked. Morrison brought Tracker home yesterday after the preliminary search. This morning, Tracker was gone. Back door was open, but Morrison swears he locked it. Dog's been missing since sometime before dawn. I felt Kodiak tense beside me, and when I looked down, he was staring directly into the fog ahead, his body rigid with attention, not fear-focused attention, like he was listening to something none of us could hear. We're going to try a different approach, Peterson announced. Single team, minimal footprint. Martinez, you and Kodiak take point. The rest of us will maintain position here and monitor radio contact. Every instinct I developed as both an officer and a handler told me this was wrong, but missing person protocol demanded we continue the search. Jennifer Walsh was somewhere ahead of us, possibly injured, possibly hypothermic. Whatever was affecting the dogs, we couldn't abandon her. I approached the invisible boundary that had stopped every dog, Kodiak reluctant but obedient beside me. As we crossed into the area the dogs had refused to enter, I felt it immediately a change in the air pressure, like stepping into a building where all the windows have been sealed. The fog seemed denser but also somehow more alive, moving in patterns that didn't match the minimal wind. Kodiak stayed close to my left leg, no longer tracking but simply following my lead. His normal enthusiasm for search work had been replaced by professional obligation, the way a soldier might advance into questionable territory because orders demanded it. The trail ahead looked identical to the trail behind us, but the quality of sound had changed. Our footsteps seemed muffled, and the constant background chatter from the radio units had faded to occasional bursts of static. When I tried to radio our position, I got no response. Kodiak, track, I commanded, hoping to redirect his attention to the search. He looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, apologetic but firm. He would stay with me, but he would not track. We continued forward for another 100 yards before I saw the first sign of Jennifer Walsh, a red bandana tied to a tree branch at eye level, clearly placed as a trail marker. Recent placement, bright against the fog-dampened forest. I photographed it and bagged it for evidence, noting that it matched the description of gear Jennifer had been carrying. 50 yards beyond the bandana, we found her campsite. The tent was set up properly, positioned on level ground with good drainage, the kind of site an experienced hiker would choose. But the tent was empty, sleeping bag undisturbed, camping gear organized as if she'd stepped away for a few minutes and planned to return. What disturbed me was the circle of stones around the campsite, not a fire ring, but a perfect circle of identical river stones, each one approximately 6 inches in diameter, placed at precise intervals around the tent's perimeter. The kind of deliberate arrangement that suggested ritual rather than casual camp organization. I photographed everything, documented the GPS coordinates, and called out Jennifer's name. The fog absorbed my voice completely, as if the sound stopped 3 feet from my mouth. Kodiak was now actively pulling back toward the trail, every line of his body language indicating he wanted to leave immediately. That's when I heard the barking. Distant, muffled by fog, but definitely a dog's bark, not the sharp alert bark of a working dog, but the repetitive, distressed bark of an animal in trouble. Kodiak heard it too, his ears swiveling toward the sound, but instead of moving toward it, he backed behind my legs. "Tracker!" I called out. The barking stopped immediately. I waited, listening, but the forest had gone completely silent. No wind, no bird calls, no insect sounds. Even our breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Then the barking started again, but from a different direction. Then another direction. Then a third. I realized I was listening to the same dog's bark, but it was coming from multiple locations simultaneously, as if the sound itself was being reflected or repeated in ways that defied the geography of the area. Kodiak began to tremble. I made the decision to retreat. As we backed away from the campsite, staying on the trail but moving toward the boundary where the other teams waited, I kept my flashlight trained ahead and my radio open, hoping for some break in the communication blackout. The barking continued, always seeming to come from wherever I wasn't looking, always just beyond the range of my flashlight beam. When we finally crossed back into the area where the dogs had originally stopped, it was like emerging from underwater. Sound returned: radio chatter, wind in the trees, the normal ambient noise of a forest. My radio immediately crackled to life, with Peterson asking for a status update. "Found evidence of Jennifer Walsh's campsite," I reported. "Tent present, occupant missing. Requesting additional units and a more comprehensive search grid." What I didn't report was the circle of stones, the simultaneous barking from multiple directions, or the fact that Kodiak was still shaking. The expanded search continued for 3 more days. Jennifer Walsh was never found. Neither was Tracker. The official report lists her as a missing person, presumed lost due to weather conditions and difficult terrain. The case remains open. Kodiak retired early, 6 months later. The veterinarian couldn't find anything wrong with him, but he never tracked the same way after that day. He'd work, he'd follow commands, but the enthusiasm was gone. He'd look at me sometimes with that same apologetic expression he'd worn in the forest, as if he was sorry he couldn't explain what he'd understood that I hadn't. I still drive past the Elwha River trailhead sometimes when my patrol route takes me in that direction. The parking area is usually empty now, despite the trail being reopened. I've heard from other handlers that their dogs react the same way Kodiak did when they approached that sector of the forest. There's an unofficial understanding among the K9 units now. We don't take search calls in that area. Some boundaries exist for reasons we don't understand, and some trails are meant to be left untracked. Some trails end where they shouldn't be able to begin. I'm Deputy Tom Hensley, K9 handler with the Nye County Sheriff's Office, and I've been tracking suspects with my bloodhound, Ranger, for 11 years across some of the most unforgiving terrain in Nevada. Ranger's nose has led us through miles of desert, up mountain slopes, and into places where most people would get lost and die of exposure. He's never lost a trail once he's picked up a scent, never been confused by terrain or weather, never failed to find what we're looking for. That's what makes what happened in Rhyolite so difficult to reconcile with everything I know about tracking. The call came in just before dawn on a Saturday in March of 2022. Border Patrol had spotted a suspected smuggling operation near the California-Nevada line, tracked it to a drop point about 15 miles south of Beatty, but lost visual contact when the suspects abandoned their vehicle and scattered into the desert on foot. Standard protocol: bring in the dogs, run the trails, round up whoever we could find before the heat got too severe. I loaded Ranger into the unit and drove the 2-hour route to the coordinates, expecting another routine tracking job through open desert. The abandoned vehicle was a beat-up pickup truck with California plates, engine still warm, driver's side door hanging open like whoever had been behind the wheel left in a hurry. Border Patrol Agent Vasquez briefed me on the situation. 3 suspects, possibly armed, carrying what appeared to be significant quantities of narcotics based on the packaging debris they'd left behind. "Trail heads northeast," Vasquez said, pointing toward the low hills that marked the edge of the old mining district. "Toward the ghost town, Rhyolite." I'd heard about it, but never had reason to visit. One of Nevada's most famous ghost towns, abandoned since the 1920s, when the gold played out and the miners moved on. Nothing left but ruins and foundations, the kind of place that attracted photographers and urban explorers, but not much else. Ranger picked up the primary scent immediately. Recent, strong, stressed sweat mixed with chemical residue that suggested drug handling. He was eager to work, pulling against his lead as we started across the desert toward the distant ruins. The morning was cool, perfect tracking weather, with enough humidity to hold scent close to the ground. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The trail was clear and direct, 3 sets of footprints in sandy soil, heading northeast at a pace that suggested urgency rather than panic. Ranger tracked confidently, occasionally circling back to confirm the scent line, his behavior indicating we were gaining on subjects who had maybe a 2-hour head start. As we approached the outskirts of Rhyolite, I could see why the suspects might have chosen this route. The ruins provided cover, multiple escape routes, and enough structural remnants to hide among if they decided to make a stand. What I didn't expect was how intact some of the buildings still were, or how the morning shadows fell between them in ways that created pockets of deep darkness even in full sunlight. The trail led us directly into the heart of the ghost town, past the famous bottle house and the skeletal remains of the bank building, toward the area where the original mining operations had been centered. Ranger was working beautifully, nose to the ground, completely focused on the scent trail that seemed to strengthen as we moved deeper into the ruins. Then, we reached the old mining district, and the trail began to behave strangely. Instead of following the logical routes between buildings or along the remnants of old roads, the scent line started leading toward areas where passage should have been impossible. Ranger would track confidently to the base of a rock outcropping, then sit and look up at a sheer face of stone, as if expecting me to follow him up a vertical cliff. When I redirected him to find an alternate route, he would circle back to the same spot and repeat the behavior. "Come on, boy," I said, checking the area for concealed paths or handholds the suspects might have used. "Show me how they went." Ranger looked at me with the patient expression bloodhounds get when they know they're right and you're not understanding them. Then pressed his nose against the rock face and whined softly. Not the alert whine that indicates he's found what we're searching for, but the confused whine that means the scent is there, but the logic of it doesn't make sense. I radioed my position to Vasquez and requested backup, explaining that the trail seemed to be leading into impassable terrain. While I waited for additional units, I decided to investigate the area more thoroughly. The rock face Ranger kept indicating was part of a natural formation that rose about 30 feet above the desert floor, weathered granite with no obvious fractures or openings. No way 3 people carrying heavy packs could have scaled it, especially not in the dark. But Ranger was insistent. Every time I tried to redirect him to search for alternative routes, he returned to the same spot and indicated upward. The scent was there, strong and recent, leading directly into solid stone. When Agent Vasquez arrived with 2 additional deputies, I explained the situation. All 3 of them examined the rock face, looking for any evidence of climbing equipment, rope marks, or concealed openings. Nothing. The stone was weathered smooth, with no holds that would support a person's weight, no signs of recent disturbance. "Maybe they doubled back," Deputy Foster suggested. "Covered their tracks somehow." I asked Ranger to cast for additional scent trails in the area. Bloodhounds can distinguish between different scents even when they overlap, and Ranger had been trained to identify backtracking patterns. But every cast brought him back to the same rock face, indicating the same upward direction. "Let's check the old mine shafts," Vasquez said. "Maybe there's a connection we're not seeing." The mining district was honeycombed with abandoned shafts, most of them properly sealed decades ago for safety reasons. We split up to examine the sealed openings, looking for any signs of recent disturbance or unauthorized entry. What we found was more of the same impossible tracking. At the third mine shaft we checked, Ranger indicated strong scent leading directly to a concrete cap that had clearly been in place for years. No tool marks, no damage to the seal, no gaps large enough for a person to squeeze through. But according to Ranger's nose, our suspects had gone directly through several feet of reinforced concrete. "This doesn't make sense," Foster said, running his hands along the edges of the seal. "There's no way anyone got through this." I was starting to wonder if we were dealing with some kind of sophisticated deception, maybe chemical agents used to confuse tracking dogs, or decoy scents designed to lead us away from the real trail. But Ranger had encountered those tactics before and learned to identify them. His behavior suggested he was following genuine human scent, not decoys or distractions. At the fourth sealed mine shaft, the impossible became undeniable. Ranger led us directly to a concrete cap identical to the others, then sat and gave his strongest alert indication, the behavior that means he's found exactly what we've been searching for. But this seal was not only intact, it was marked with a date stamp showing it had been poured in 1997, more than 25 years ago. "Tom," Deputy Morrison said, pointing to something I'd missed. "Look at this." Pressed into the concrete, as if placed there while it was still wet, was a clear boot print, size 11, distinctive tread pattern, fresh enough that you could see individual details of the sole design. The same print we'd been tracking across the desert. I stared at that boot print for a long time, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew about concrete curing, about time, about the basic physics of how objects interact with solid matter. The print was definitely there, definitely recent, definitely made by one of our suspects. But it was also definitely pressed into concrete that had been poured decades before those suspects were born. Ranger was getting agitated now, pacing back and forth in front of the sealed shaft, whining in a way I'd never heard from him before. Not confused, but frustrated, as if he could smell our suspects on the other side of the concrete, but couldn't understand why I wasn't doing something about it. That's when I heard the voices. Muffled, distant, but definitely human voices coming from beneath our feet. Vasquez heard them too. I could see it in his expression, the way he tilted his head toward the ground. Morrison and Foster were checking their equipment, assuming the sounds were coming through their radios, but the voices weren't electronic. They were organic, immediate, and they were coming from under the sealed mine shaft. "Hello?" I called out, pressing my ear to the concrete. "This is Nye County Sheriff's Office. Can anyone hear me?" The voices stopped immediately. We waited, listening, but the silence stretched on until I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of footsteps moving through what sounded like a tunnel system directly beneath us. Vasquez radioed for heavy equipment to open the seal, but by the time the machinery arrived 3 hours later, the sounds had stopped completely. When they finally broke through the concrete cap, they found exactly what the mining records indicated: a shaft that had been filled with tailings and debris in 1997, compacted solid, no air spaces large enough for a mouse to navigate, let alone 3 adult humans. But at the bottom of the shaft, mixed in with 25-year-old mining debris, the recovery team found a cell phone with a Nevada area code, manufactured in 2021. The phone's GPS history showed it had been in constant motion through underground tunnels that, according to every geological survey of the area, simply don't exist. The case was eventually closed as a loss of trail due to extreme weather conditions and difficult terrain. The official report makes no mention of boot prints in old concrete or voices from sealed mine shafts. The cell phone was logged as evidence and filed away. Ranger never tracked the same way after that day. He'd work, he'd follow scents, but there was a hesitancy in his behavior that hadn't been there before, as if he'd learned that some trails lead to places where the rules don't apply. Sometimes, When we're working in areas with old mining activity, I catch him staring at the ground with that same frustrated expression he wore in Rhyolite, as if he can smell something I can't and doesn't trust what his nose is telling him. I drive through Beatty occasionally when my patrol route takes me in that direction, and I can see the ruins of Rhyolite in the distance, baking in the desert heat. I've never been back. Some trails are better left unfollowed, and some scents are better left untraced. The desert keeps its secrets, and some of them are older than the concrete we use to seal them away. Water has a memory that runs deeper than sound waves can reach. I'm State Trooper Victoria Nakamura, Oregon State Police, and I've been working search and rescue with my Belgian Malinois, Shadow, for 9 years across the Cascade Range. Shadow is trained for wilderness tracking, evidence detection, and water recovery, one of only 12 dogs in the state certified for underwater search work. He's located drowning victims at depths where sonar failed, found evidence submerged for months, and never given a false alert in nearly a decade of service. That's why what happened at Crater Lake challenged everything I thought I understood about canine behavior and the reliability of our partnership. The call came in on a Thursday evening in September of 2023. Two backpackers, Sarah Chen and Michael Rodriguez, had failed to check in with their emergency contacts after a planned 3-day camping trip around Crater Lake's rim. Their car was still in the parking area, campsite reservation confirmed, but no sign of them at their designated camping location. Standard missing persons protocol in national park territory, complicated by the approaching weather system that promised to drop the first snow of the season. I loaded Shadow into the unit and made the 2-hour drive up to Crater Lake National Park, expecting another routine search that would likely end with embarrassed hikers found safe at an unplanned campsite, maybe weather delayed or dealing with equipment problems. The park sees dozens of these cases every season, and most resolve within 24 hours. Park Ranger Williams met me at the visitor center as the sun was setting behind the western rim. He briefed me on the situation. Sarah and Michael had been experienced backpackers, properly equipped with detailed itineraries filed with the Park Service. Their last confirmed sighting was at the Rim Village Overlook around noon on Tuesday, where they'd spoken with other visitors about hiking plans and weather conditions. Anything unusual about the search area? I asked, checking Shadow's gear. Williams hesitated in a way that made me look up from my equipment check. We've had some reports from other visitors. Dogs acting strange near the lake shore. Locals bringing their pets up here have mentioned unusual behavior. What kind of unusual behavior? Staring at the water, refusing to leave certain areas. Some owners say their dogs have been escaping at night and coming up here on their own. He gestured toward the rim. Just something to be aware of. I started Shadow on scent articles from the missing backpackers' car clothing that still held their individual scents clearly. He picked up both trails immediately, confident and eager, leading us along the rim trail toward the area where they'd planned to camp. The evening was clear but cold, perfect conditions for scent retention, and Shadow worked with his usual focused intensity. For the first hour, the tracking proceeded normally. Shadow followed a clear trail along the established hiking routes, occasionally circling back to confirm scent markers, his behavior indicating recent passage by our missing persons. We found their first night's campsite exactly where their itinerary indicated it should be properly established, recently used, but already broken down and vacated according to their planned schedule. The trail from their first campsite led toward a more remote section of the rim, an area where backcountry camping was permitted but rarely used due to the challenging terrain and limited water access. Shadow tracked confidently for another mile before his behavior began to change. We were approaching a section of the rim where the trail curved close to the lake's edge, offering spectacular views of the water nearly 2,000 feet below. Shadow had been tracking with his nose to the ground when he suddenly stopped and raised his head, staring directly at the lake surface. Not the alert posture he takes when he detects the scent we're following, but a focused attention I'd never seen from him before. He stood completely still for nearly a minute, ears forward, body tense, as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Shadow, track," I commanded, trying to redirect his attention to the search. He looked at me briefly, then back at the lake, and whined softly. Not his usual working whine, but something that sounded almost mournful. When I checked the scent trail, I found that Sarah and Michael's tracks led directly to the rim's edge at this point, then simply disappeared. No signs of a struggle, no equipment dropped, no indication of an accident. The trail just ended at a spot where the ground was solid and stable, with no evidence that anyone had gone over the edge. I radioed our position to Ranger Williams and requested additional search teams to check the area below the rim for any signs of a fall. While waiting for backup, I decided to work Shadow in expanding circles around the last confirmed scent location, hoping to pick up the trail where it resumed. That's when Shadow began alerting to the lake itself. He walked to the very edge of the rim and sat in his formal alert position, staring down at a specific point in the water. When I moved him to different locations along the rim, he would track back to the same spot and repeat the alert. According to Shadow's behavior, what we were searching for was directly below us, approximately 50 feet from the shoreline, in water that the Park Service measured at over 600 feet deep. "Williams, this is Nakamura. I need a dive team and sonar equipment at my location." "Copy that. But Trooper, we ran sonar along that entire section yesterday as part of the preliminary search. Water's too deep for recreational diving, and we didn't detect anything unusual." I looked down at Shadow, who was maintaining his alert position with the kind of unwavering focus he usually reserved for definitive finds. "My dog is indicating a strong alert for this specific location. Something's down there." The sonar team arrived at first light the next morning, along with dive specialists from the county sheriff's office and additional park rangers. Shadow immediately led them to the exact same spot on the rim, alerting to the same underwater location with complete consistency. The sonar operator, a veteran named Captain Brooks, ran multiple passes over the area Shadow had indicated. "I'm not reading anything unusual," he reported after an hour of scanning. "Bottom contour is consistent with the rest of the lake bed. No debris, no anomalies, no objects of significant size." But Shadow remained convinced. Every time I moved him away from the alert location, he would return to the same spot and resume his focused stare at the water below. That's when Captain Brooks mentioned something that made my skin crawl. "You know what's interesting," he said, adjusting his sonar equipment. "I've been running lake surveys for 20 years, and I've never seen sonar readings quite like this. The return signals are inconsistent, almost like something's interfering with the sound waves, but in a pattern I can't identify." As the day progressed and additional search teams arrived, I began to notice something that confirmed Ranger Williams' earlier comments about unusual animal behavior. Dogs from other search teams, pets belonging to park visitors, even wild animals seemed drawn to the shoreline near the point Shadow kept indicating. A family with 2 golden retrievers had driven up from Klamath Falls to help with the search. Both dogs immediately ran to the water's edge at the same location and began the kind of excited whining and pacing behavior that usually indicates they've detected something significant. When their owners tried to lead them away, the dogs resisted, constantly looking back toward the water. "They've been doing this for weeks," the owner told me. "Ever since we started bringing them up here for hikes, they act like there's something in the lake they need to get to, but they won't actually go in the water." By the 3rd day of the search, we had 6 different dogs from 4 different agencies, all alerting to the same underwater location. Sonar continued to show nothing. Underwater cameras revealed only the typical deep water environment of a volcanic crater lake, but the dogs remained absolutely convinced that something was there. That's when the divers reported the temperature anomaly. "It's subtle," the lead diver explained after his second descent to the area, "but there's definitely a localized cold spot, at approximately 200 feet depth, directly below where the dogs keep indicating. Water temperature drops about 8 degrees in a roughly circular area, maybe 30 feet in diameter. Is that unusual? In a lake this deep, thermal layers are common, but usually they're horizontal, related to seasonal temperature changes and circulation patterns. A circular cold spot at depth, that's not something I've encountered before. On the fourth night of the search, I decided to stay at the lake after the other teams had returned to town. Shadow and I made camp near the rim, and I planned to observe the area during night hours, hoping to identify anything we might have missed during daylight operations. What I witnessed defied every rational explanation I could construct. Beginning around midnight, dogs began arriving at the shoreline. Not search dogs or pets with owners, but what appeared to be local animals, farm dogs, strays, possibly even wild canids emerging from the forest and gathering at the water's edge near the point where Shadow kept alerting. They came individually and in small groups, approaching the shore silently, then sitting in a rough semicircle facing the lake. Shadow was immediately alert, but not agitated. He walked to the rim and took his place among the other animals, all of them staring at the same underwater location, with the kind of patient attention usually associated with hunting or waiting for prey. I counted more than 20 dogs gathered along the shoreline, all maintaining the same focused vigil. No barking, no interaction between animals that clearly didn't know each other, just a collective watching that continued until the first light of dawn, when they dispersed as quietly as they had arrived. The official search for Sarah Chen and Michael Rodriguez was suspended after 7 days due to weather conditions and lack of viable leads. The case remains open, classified as a wilderness disappearance with undetermined circumstances. But the dogs continue to gather. Park rangers report that the nightly congregations have become a regular occurrence, with animals traveling from as far as 50 miles away to maintain their vigil at the lakeshore. The sonar anomaly persists, and water temperature measurements confirm the circular cold spot at depth, though no instruments have been able to identify its cause. Shadow retired from active duty 6 months later, not due to injury or age, but because his behavior around water changed fundamentally after Crater Lake. He would work, he would track, but whenever we approached any body of water deeper than a few feet, he would stop and stare into the depths with that same patient, waiting expression. I drive past Crater Lake occasionally when my patrol route takes me through the area, usually in the evening when the visitor traffic has cleared out. I've never stopped to investigate further, but I can see lights along the rim where the dogs maintain their nightly watch, and I wonder what they're waiting for, what they remember that we've forgotten, and whether some searches are meant to continue long after we've officially given up. Water remembers what sonar cannot detect, and sometimes the most important evidence lies beyond the reach of any instrument except instinct. Some landscapes refuse to let you leave them behind. I'm Park Ranger David Webb, National Park Service, and I've been working law enforcement in Badlands National Park for 14 years with my tracking dog, Scout, a mixed breed with bloodhound and shepherd parentage who's proven himself on everything from missing person searches to evidence recovery in terrain that would challenge most humans. Scout has tracked suspects through maze-like canyon systems, located evidence scattered across miles of prairie, and never once lost his orientation in country where people regularly get turned around and need rescue. That's what made what happened during the Henderson case so fundamentally disturbing, not just because Scout got lost, but because he got lost in a way that defied the basic geography of the area we both knew better than our own backyard. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in August of 2024. Hikers had discovered what appeared to be a makeshift campsite in the Castle Trail area, abandoned but recent, with personal belongings scattered in a pattern that suggested either a hasty departure or some kind of disturbance. Local law enforcement requested Park Service assistance to search for additional evidence, possible signs of foul play, or any indication of what had happened to whoever had been camping in an area where overnight stays weren't permitted. I loaded Scout into the Ranger vehicle and drove to the coordinates, expecting a straightforward evidence search that would probably conclude with a citation for illegal camping and maybe a report about littering or minor vandalism. The Castle Trail area is one of our most popular hiking destinations, well-marked and heavily traveled, with terrain that's challenging but predictable. I knew every ridge, every wash, every landmark within a 5-mile radius of where we'd be working. The abandoned campsite was exactly what the reporting hikers had described: a circle of stones arranged for a fire ring, scattered food wrappers and camping gear, a sleeping bag dragged across the ground, as if someone had left quickly in the middle of the night. But what struck me immediately was the location about 200 yards off the established trail, in an area that required scrambling over loose rock to reach, not the kind of spot a casual camper would choose. I started Scout on a general search pattern, hoping to locate additional evidence or track whoever had been camping to determine whether they'd left voluntarily or under duress. He immediately picked up a scent trail leading away from the campsite, heading northeast toward the more remote sections of the park where the Badland formations become increasingly complex and difficult to navigate. For the first hour, Scout worked normally, following what appeared to be a clear trail across relatively open ground, occasionally circling back to confirm the scent line, his behavior indicating recent passage by a single individual. The morning was calm, with excellent visibility, perfect conditions for tracking work, and we made steady progress toward the area where the prairie begins to break up into the distinctive layered rock formations that give the Badlands their name. Then Scout led me down into a draw I didn't recognize. I'd been working this section of the park for over a decade, had hiked every established trail and most of the unmarked routes that experienced visitors sometimes used. I thought I knew the topography well enough to navigate without a map in most conditions, but Scout was leading me into terrain that felt unfamiliar, despite being in an area I'd patrolled hundreds of times. The draw was deeper and narrower than the landscape features I remembered from this location, with rock walls that rose higher on either side and created a sense of enclosure that seemed inconsistent with the generally open character of the Badland formations. I checked my GPS to confirm our position, but the readings showed us moving through an area that, according to the topographical data, should have been relatively flat prairie. "Scout, easy," I called, slowing our pace to give myself time to reorient. He looked back at me briefly, then continued tracking with the focused intensity that indicated he was following a strong, recent scent. Whatever he was tracking, the trail was clear and fresh enough to maintain his complete attention. As we followed the draw deeper into the formations, I began to notice other details that didn't match my memory of the area. The rock layers seemed more pronounced, creating shelf-like ledges that provided natural steps up the canyon walls. The overall geology looked consistent with Badland formations, but the specific arrangement and scale felt wrong, like familiar elements reassembled in unfamiliar patterns. I tried to radio my position to the park dispatch, but got only static. Not unusual in the more remote areas where the terrain can interfere with radio transmission, but concerning given that I was becoming uncertain about exactly where we were. After another 30 minutes of tracking, Scout suddenly stopped and began casting in a wide circle, nose to the ground, searching for the continuation of whatever scent trail he'd been following. This was normal behavior when a trail terminated or when environmental factors had dispersed the scent, but his casting pattern brought him back to the exact spot where he'd originally stopped. He sat and looked at me with an expression of confusion I'd never seen from him before. I checked the area for any obvious obstacles or distractions that might have interrupted his tracking, but found nothing unusual. The ground was typical Badland soil and rock, with no water features, significant elevation changes, or environmental factors that would cause a scent trail to simply vanish. "Scout, cast," I commanded, directing him to expand his search pattern. He immediately picked up the scent trail again, but now it led back in the direction we'd just come from, following what appeared to be exactly the same route we'd used to reach this location. I assumed we were backtracking, perhaps because the original trail had doubled back, or because Scout had lost the primary scent and was following our own trail. But as we retraced our path, I realized we weren't covering the same ground we'd crossed 30 minutes earlier. The draw we'd followed down into the formations was now leading us up and out, but the landmarks I remembered from our descent weren't present during our ascent. Rock formations that should have been on our left were now on our right, and the general orientation of the canyon seemed to have shifted in subtle but definite ways. More disturbing, when Scout's trail brought us back to what should have been our starting point, we weren't at the abandoned campsite where we'd begun the search. We were standing in an open area that looked similar to the campsite location, with the same general topography and vegetation, but the campsite itself wasn't there. No fire ring, no scattered gear, no evidence that anyone had ever made camp in the area. I checked my GPS again and found that our coordinates matched the original campsite location exactly, but the physical evidence of our investigation had simply disappeared. Scout immediately picked up the scent trail again, leading away from our position in what appeared to be exactly the same direction he'd followed originally. Same northeast heading, same confident tracking behavior, same apparent destination somewhere in the maze of badland formations ahead of us. I decided to follow, hoping that retracing the route would lead us back to familiar terrain and help me understand what was happening to our navigation. What happened next challenged every assumption I had about the basic consistency of physical space. Scout led me through the same sequence of terrain features: the narrow draw, the high rock walls, the increasingly complex canyon system. But this time I paid careful attention to specific landmarks, photographing distinctive rock formations and using my GPS to log waypoints every few minutes. When Scout stopped at the same location where he'd lost the trail before, I checked our recorded route on the GPS display. According to the device, we'd traveled in a perfect circle, returning to within 10 feet of our starting coordinates, despite crossing several miles of terrain that had felt consistently directional. But the landscape around us was identical to what we'd encountered during our first passage through the area, not the campsite location where the GPS insisted we were standing. I tried the radio again and got the same static. I tried my cell phone and found no signal, which wasn't unusual for this area, but added to the sense that we were becoming isolated in terrain that was behaving in ways I couldn't understand. Scout was casting for the scent trail again, and when he picked it up, he looked at me with an expression that seemed almost apologetic, as if he understood that what he was about to do didn't make sense but felt compelled to do it anyway. For the third time, he led me through the identical sequence of terrain features, following what appeared to be the same scent trail through the same landscape, ending at the same location where the trail terminated, and he would begin the casting behavior that would lead to finding the scent again and starting the entire circuit over. By the sixth repetition, I was documenting everything systematically, trying to identify any variations in the route, any changes in the terrain, any explanation for why we seemed to be trapped in a loop of landscape that existed independently of the park geography I thought I knew. The rock formations remained consistent, the scent trail remained strong, and Scout's behavior remained professional and focused, but we were clearly moving through space in a way that violated basic assumptions about how terrain works. During the 8th circuit, I noticed something that made me stop documenting and start moving toward what felt like panic. The sun hadn't moved. Despite the fact that we'd been tracking for what felt like several hours, covering the same route multiple times, the sun remained in exactly the same position in the sky it had occupied when we started. The shadows cast by the rock formations fell at identical angles. The temperature remained constant, and the quality of light never changed. We were moving through time, as well as space, in ways that didn't follow normal rules. I made the decision to break the pattern. Instead of following Scout when he inevitably picked up the scent trail for the 9th time, I called him back and chose a different direction entirely, leading him up and out of the canyon system toward what should have been the main park road. After 20 minutes of hiking through terrain that felt increasingly normal and recognizable, we reached the parking area where I'd left the ranger vehicle. Scout immediately returned to his usual relaxed demeanor, and my radio started working normally. When I called Park Dispatch to report our status, I found that only 45 minutes had elapsed since I'd checked in from the original campsite location. The abandoned campsite was exactly where it had been when we started, with all the evidence and scattered gear intact. My photographs from the repeated circuits showed only images of the normal campsite area, with no record of the canyon system we'd spent hours navigating. The case was closed as routine illegal camping with no evidence of foul play. Scout returned to normal working behavior immediately, but I've noticed that he's reluctant to track in certain areas of the park now, particularly in terrain with complex canyon systems or landscape features that create enclosed feeling spaces. He'll work, but with less enthusiasm, and he frequently looks back at me as if checking to make sure I'm still following. I've requested transfers to different sections of the park twice since then, but each time I find myself assigned back to the same patrol areas that include the Castle Trail region. Some landscapes don't let you leave, and some trails lead back to themselves, no matter which direction you think you're traveling. The Badlands remember every footstep, and sometimes they decide those footsteps should be repeated indefinitely. There are places where even the desert's apex predators refuse to hunt. I'm Sheriff's Deputy Carmen Valdez, Inyo County Sheriff's Office, and I've been working narcotics enforcement with my German Shepherd Rebel for 7 years across the Eastern Sierra and Death Valley regions. Rebel is trained for drug detection, tracking, and apprehension work, certified to locate everything from marijuana grows to methamphetamine labs in terrain that ranges from alpine forests to desert wasteland. He's found operations hidden in abandoned mines, buried in sand dunes, and camouflaged among Joshua trees where human eyes would never spot them. In 7 years of partnership, Rebel has never refused to enter an area where I've directed him to search, never shown fear of terrain or conditions, never backed down from a job. That's what made what happened in Death Valley so fundamentally unsettling, not just Rebel's refusal to work, but the fact that every law enforcement dog in 3 counties exhibited identical behavior when confronted with the same location. The case started with aerial surveillance reports in October of 2023. DEA aircraft flying routine reconnaissance over Death Valley had spotted what appeared to be cultivation structures in a remote valley system approximately 20 miles southeast of Furnace Creek. Infrared imaging showed geometric patterns consistent with greenhouse operations, water distribution systems, and residential structures that suggested a significant illegal growing operation. Standard follow-up protocol called for ground teams to investigate, gather evidence, and coordinate with federal agencies for a joint enforcement action. I loaded Rebel into the patrol unit and drove the 3-hour route to the coordinates, expecting another routine drug bust in desert country where illegal grows had been increasing over the past few years. The location was remote enough to avoid casual detection, but accessible enough for the kind of supply runs that large-scale cultivation operations required. Based on the aerial images, we were looking at a sophisticated setup that probably represented months of construction and significant financial investment. The coordinates led us to a dirt access road that branched off from a seldom-used Park Service route, marked only by tire tracks in sandy soil and the kind of minimal disturbance that suggested regular but careful traffic. Agent Phillips from DEA met us at the staging area, along with deputies from Kern and San Bernardino counties and their K9 units, a total of 6 dogs with different specializations and training backgrounds. Structures should be approximately 2 miles northeast from here, Phillips briefed us, reviewing the aerial photographs on a tablet. Latest flyover was yesterday morning. Confirmed presence of multiple buildings, irrigation infrastructure, and what appears to be vehicle parking areas. The photographs were clear and detailed, showing a valley floor with obviously artificial structures arranged in organized patterns. Greenhouses, storage buildings, living quarters, and a network of roads connecting the various facilities. The kind of setup that represented serious criminal enterprise, probably millions of dollars in illegal cultivation. Any intel on security measures or personnel? I asked, checking Rebel's equipment. Negative on personnel sightings, but we're assuming armed resistance, standard precautions, coordinated approach, dogs lead for drug detection and early warning. We started across the desert in a loose formation, 6 handlers with 6 dogs, moving toward a valley system that showed clearly on our GPS displays and topographical maps. The morning was cool, perfect working conditions, and all the dogs seemed eager and focused as we began the approach to the target area. For the first mile, everything proceeded normally. The terrain was typical: Death Valley desert sandy washes, scattered rocks, sparse vegetation adapted to extreme conditions. Our dogs worked the area systematically, checking for scents that might indicate human activity, drug processing, or security measures we'd need to be aware of. Then we reached the valley entrance, and every dog stopped. Not the alert behavior they display when they detect drugs or contraband, but a complete refusal to advance. 6 dogs from different departments, with different training and experience levels, all exhibiting identical reluctance to enter what appeared to be ordinary desert terrain. "Valdez, what's your dog's status?" Phillips called over the radio. I looked down at Rebel, who was sitting at the valley entrance, staring ahead with an expression of focused attention I'd never seen from him before. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of cautious evaluation, as if he was assessing something I couldn't perceive. "Rebel's indicating reluctance," I reported. Not an alert, but definite hesitation. "Same here," came responses from the other handlers. "Dogs aren't advancing." Phillips consulted his GPS and aerial photographs. "Coordinates confirm this is the correct location. Structures should be visible from this position." I looked ahead into the valley and saw only empty desert. Sandy floor, rocky outcroppings, scattered vegetation, the kind of landscape that characterized most of Death Valley's remote areas. No buildings, no cultivation structures, no signs of human activity, despite being at the exact coordinates where aerial surveillance had documented a major illegal operation. "Phillips, are you sure about these coordinates?" "Confirmed. Latest aerial reconnaissance was less than 24 hours ago." Agent Phillips radioed for updated aerial support to verify the target location while we waited at the valley entrance. All 6 dogs maintained their reluctant postures, alert but unwilling to advance, as if they could detect something in the valley that posed a threat we couldn't identify. 20 minutes later, Phillips received confirmation from the aircraft currently overhead. Aerial report structures clearly visible at your coordinates. Multiple buildings, active irrigation systems, recent vehicle activity. But from our ground position, the valley remained empty. Copy that, aerial. Ground team is not visual on any structures at this location. Understood. Recommend ground team advance to grid reference 77 Alpha for better visual perspective. Phillips consulted his maps and identified a rise about a quarter mile into the valley that would provide elevated observation of the target area. Simple solution: advance to higher ground, gain visual contact with the structures that aerial surveillance confirmed were present. Except our dogs continued to refuse entry into the valley. I tried every technique I'd learned for encouraging reluctant working dogs: positive reinforcement, direct commands, treats, even attempting to lead Rebel by his collar. He would approach to within about 10 feet of what appeared to be an invisible boundary, then stop and back away, whining softly, but maintaining his refusal to cross into the valley proper. The other handlers reported identical behavior from their dogs. Professional working animals, trained to follow commands under extreme conditions, all exhibiting the same unexplained reluctance to enter terrain that looked identical to the desert we'd been crossing for the past hour. We proceed without the dogs, Phillips decided. Leave them with one handler at the valley entrance, continue with reduced team. Deputy Jackson volunteered to remain with the dogs, while the rest of us advanced into the valley on foot, hoping to locate the structures that aerial surveillance insisted were directly ahead of us. As we moved deeper into the valley, I began to experience the same reluctance the dogs had shown. Not fear, exactly, but a growing sense that we were moving into territory where we weren't welcome, where our presence represented some kind of intrusion or violation of boundaries that weren't marked by any visible signs but felt increasingly real with every step. The temperature seemed to drop as we advanced, despite clear skies and full sun. The quality of light became strange, as if the air itself was filtering the sunlight in ways that created subtle color shifts and shadow patterns that didn't match the terrain features casting them. After 30 minutes of hiking, we reached the grid coordinates where the structures should have been clearly visible. Phillips checked his GPS multiple times, confirmed our position against the aerial photographs, and radioed the aircraft for real-time guidance. "Aerial confirms multiple structures directly below your position," came the response. "Large greenhouse complex, residential buildings, active cultivation areas." But we were standing in empty desert. No buildings, no cultivation, no signs that humans had ever been in the area. The GPS coordinates were exact, the aerial guidance was precise, but the physical evidence simply wasn't there. "Ground team, be advised you are walking directly through the main cultivation area, according to our visual." I looked around at sand and rocks and scattered desert plants, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what multiple aircraft crews were reporting. The disconnect was complete and absolute. That's when Deputy Morrison spotted the footprints. Fresh human footprints in sandy soil, leading through the area where we were standing, arranged in patterns that suggested people moving between structures and work areas that we couldn't see. The prints were recent enough to show clear tread patterns, numerous enough to indicate significant ongoing activity, and they followed pathways that connected invisible buildings in an invisible cultivation facility. Phillips radioed for immediate backup and requested ground-penetrating radar to identify any underground facilities that might explain the discrepancy between aerial observation and ground reality. But as we waited for additional resources, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The footprints were following us. Not the prints we'd been observing, but new prints appearing in the sandy ground behind us as we moved, as if invisible people were tracking our movement through their invisible facility. Fresh impressions showing up in areas where we'd just walked, made by feet we couldn't see, belonging to people who were apparently watching us from buildings that existed only from an aerial perspective. I radioed Jackson at the valley entrance to check on the dog's status and found him in an increasingly agitated state. "The dogs are going crazy," he reported, all of them staring into the valley, whining, acting like they can see something we can't. "And Deputy, I'm getting radio chatter." "What kind of radio chatter?" "Voices on our frequency, but not from any of our units. People talking about watching the intruders, about protecting the operation, but there's no one out here. The investigation was suspended, pending arrival of specialized equipment and federal resources to resolve the discrepancies between aerial surveillance and ground observation." The case was eventually classified as equipment malfunction and transferred to a joint task force for further analysis. But the radio voices continued for months afterward, intercepted by law enforcement agencies across 3 counties. Conversations about cultivation schedules, security measures, and ongoing operations in a Death Valley location where ground teams consistently found nothing but empty desert. Rebel never returned to full working capacity after that day. He'd perform his duties, but with constant backward glances toward areas we'd cleared, as if expecting to see invisible pursuers that only he could detect. His behavior around desert terrain became cautious and reluctant, and he eventually retired early due to what the veterinarian classified as stress-related behavioral changes. I still patrol the Death Valley region, but I avoid that particular valley system. The aerial surveillance reports continue to document active cultivation operations at those coordinates, but no ground team has ever been able to locate physical evidence of the structures that multiple aircraft crews observe and photograph on a regular basis. Some operations exist in spaces that can only be seen from above, and some territories are protected by boundaries that only certain animals can sense. Time moves in one direction, except when it doesn't. I'm Highway Patrol Officer Marcus Reed, California Highway Patrol, and I've been working traffic enforcement with my narcotics detection dog, Diesel, for 6 years along Highway 395 through the Eastern Sierra. Diesel is a black Labrador retriever trained to detect controlled substances, with a success rate that's made him one of the most reliable drug dogs in our district. He's never given a false alert, never missed contraband during a vehicle search, and never shown confusion about what he's detecting or where it's located. In 6 years of partnership, Diesel's nose has been more accurate than any piece of technology we use, more reliable than witness statements, and more consistent than most of the evidence we collect. That's what made what happened near Mono Lake so fundamentally disturbing, not just that Diesel detected something that wasn't there, but that he detected something that wouldn't be there for another 3 days. The incident occurred during a routine patrol shift on a Wednesday evening in November of 2024. I was working the stretch of highway between Bridgeport and Lee Vining, monitoring traffic patterns and conducting selective enforcement stops in an area known for drug trafficking between Nevada and California. The weather was clear, traffic was light, and I was running standard interdiction operations with drivers whose behavior or vehicle characteristics suggested possible contraband transport. Around 8:30 p.m., I observed a late-model sedan with Nevada plates traveling southbound at slightly above the speed limit. Nothing particularly suspicious, but fitting the profile for a routine traffic stop. The driver was maintaining proper following distance, using signals appropriately, but there was something about the vehicle's positioning on the roadway that suggested the kind of cautious driving behavior often associated with people transporting illegal materials. I initiated a traffic stop approximately 2 miles north of the Mono Lake Overlook area, a location I'd used hundreds of times for vehicle searches because it provided good visibility, safe positioning off the travel lanes, and enough space to deploy Diesel if the stop developed into a drug investigation. The driver was cooperative during the initial contact license, registration, insurance documentation, all in order. Harold Brennan, age 42, Nevada resident with a clean driving record and no outstanding warrants. He seemed nervous, but not unusually so, the kind of mild anxiety most people show during traffic stop. His story about traveling to Los Angeles for business meetings was consistent and detailed. His behavior professional and respectful. Nothing about the stop suggested probable cause for a vehicle search, but I decided to walk Diesel around the vehicle as a routine precaution. Standard procedure in an area with high drug trafficking activity, and Diesel enjoyed the work even when we didn't find anything. I retrieved Diesel from the patrol unit and began a systematic exterior search of the sedan, starting with the driver's side and working clockwise around the vehicle. Diesel showed normal working behavior, nose to the ground, focused but not indicating any detection of controlled substances. Then we reached the rear passenger side of the vehicle, and Diesel gave the strongest alert I'd ever seen from him. Not just the normal sitting alert that indicates drug detection, but an intense, focused behavior that suggested he was detecting significant quantities of controlled substances in close proximity. He was practically vibrating with excitement, looking at me with the expression he got when we'd made a major find, waiting for permission to show me exactly where the drugs were located. The problem was, I couldn't see anything that would justify his alert. I requested consent from Brennan to search his vehicle, which he provided immediately and without hesitation. I began a systematic interior search, focusing on the rear passenger area where Diesel had alerted, but found nothing unusual. No contraband, no drug residue, no evidence of recent drug transport, no hidden compartments or modification that might conceal illegal materials. Diesel remained convinced that drugs were present, returning repeatedly to the same rear passenger door area, alerting with increasing intensity, as if he couldn't understand why I wasn't finding what he was detecting. "Sorry for the inconvenience," I told Brennan after completing the search. "Sometimes the dogs pick up residual scents from previous contact with drugs. You're free to go." But Diesel's behavior troubled me. In 6 years of partnership, he'd never given what appeared to be a false alert, and his current behavior suggested absolute certainty about drug detection rather than confusion or error. I documented the traffic stop in my report, noting Diesel's alert and the negative search results, then continued patrol duties in the area. But something about the incident felt unresolved, like I'd missed something important that Diesel had tried to show me. 3 days later, I received a call from Detective Sarah Wong at the Mono County Sheriff's Office. "Reed, we had a significant drug bust yesterday evening near Mono Lake. Vehicle matching the description from one of your recent traffic stops. Wondering if you can provide any background information." I pulled my report from the Wednesday evening stop and found the details. Late model sedan, Nevada plates, driver identified as Harold Brennan, stopped approximately 2 miles north of Mono Lake Overlook. "When did your bust occur?" I asked. "Saturday evening, around 9 p.m. Same location where you conducted your traffic stop. Same vehicle, same driver. But this time he had 40 pounds of methamphetamine in a hidden compartment behind the rear passenger seat. The same location where Diesel had alerted 3 days earlier. Detective, can you tell me exactly where the drugs were concealed?" "Custom compartment built into the rear passenger side door panel. Sophisticated construction, probably took months to build. Definitely designed for regular transport operations." The exact location where Diesel had given his strongest alert during a search that revealed nothing. I drove to the Mono County Sheriff's Office to examine the evidence and interview Brennan, hoping to understand how Diesel could have detected drugs that weren't present during my search, but were found in the same vehicle 3 days later. Brennan was cooperative during questioning, explaining that he'd been transporting drugs along this route for several months, using the sophisticated concealment system to avoid detection during traffic stops. He'd made the same trip the previous Wednesday, the night I'd stopped him, but without carrying any contraband. "Wednesday was a positioning run," he explained. "I was driving the route empty, checking for law enforcement activity, making sure the timing and logistics were solid before making the actual transport run on Saturday." "So there were no drugs in your vehicle on Wednesday night?" "Nothing. Completely clean. I never carry drugs on reconnaissance trips." But Diesel had detected drugs with absolute certainty at the exact location where they would be concealed 3 days later. I consulted with canine training specialists, veterinarians, and other canine handlers, trying to understand how a drug detection dog could alert to controlled substances that weren't present at the time of the search. Every expert I spoke with confirmed that dogs detect actual chemical compounds, not predictions or possibilities. "Dogs can't smell the future, Doctor," Martinez, a veterinary behaviorist, explained. "They respond to chemical stimuli that exist in the present moment. If your dog alerted, there had to be something there to detect." But the evidence was clear. Diesel had detected drugs that wouldn't be present for another 72 hours. I began reviewing my other recent traffic stops, looking for patterns or anomalies that might explain what had happened near Mono Lake. What I found was more disturbing than a single unexplained incident. Over the past 6 months, Diesel had given alerts during vehicle searches that initially appeared to be false positives, but which later proved to be accurate when the same vehicles were stopped by other officers days or weeks later carrying drugs in the exact locations where Diesel had originally alerted. A pattern of detection that suggested Diesel was somehow sensing controlled substances before they were physically present in the vehicles he was searching. I documented everything systematically: dates, times, locations, vehicle descriptions, driver information, and the eventual discoveries that confirmed Diesel's alerts. The pattern was consistent and undeniable. Diesel was detecting drugs that would be there, not drugs that were there. The implications were impossible to reconcile with everything I understood about canine olfactory capabilities and the basic nature of time and causality. During our next training session, I decided to test Diesel's behavior under controlled conditions. I arranged for a vehicle to be brought to our training facility, a car that had never been used for drug transport, cleaned thoroughly and certified free of any controlled substance residue. Diesel alerted to the rear trunk area with absolute certainty. 2 days later, that same vehicle was stopped by highway patrol officers in Riverside County carrying 15 pounds of cocaine concealed in the rear trunk compartment. The official reports described these incidents as examples of exceptional canine detection capabilities and sophisticated trafficking patterns that involve vehicles being used for multiple transport operations over extended periods. The documentation suggests that Diesel is detecting residual scents from future drug transport, rather than acknowledging the temporal impossibility of such detection. Diesel retired from active duty 8 months later, not due to age or injury, but because his alerts had become so accurate, they were being used to predict drug trafficking operations before they occurred, raising legal questions about probable cause and the admissibility of evidence obtained through what appeared to be precognitive investigation techniques. I still patrol Highway 395 through the Eastern Sierra, but without Diesel's partnership. Sometimes, when I'm working the area near Mono Lake, I think about time and scent and the possibility that some phenomena exist outside the linear progression we assume governs cause and effect. Diesel lives in comfortable retirement now, but I've noticed that he still alerts to things that aren't there yet. Visitors' cars that will carry prescription medications, delivery trucks that will transport agricultural chemicals, aircraft that will pass overhead carrying cargo he somehow detects hours before their scheduled arrival. Some noses are sensitive enough to detect the future, and some partnerships reveal that reality operates according to rules we don't fully understand.